My name is Elena, and I just turned 27. Last week, my mother, a woman who treats affection like a currency she can devalue at will, orchestrated a birthday dinner for me at a vintage-style diner downtown. I walked into the establishment anticipating the usual menu of strained conversation and thinly veiled criticisms regarding my life choices. I expected to feel small. I expected to feel tolerated. What I did not expect was for the punchline of the evening to be my own existence, frosted onto a sheet cake. After we had finished a meal that tasted mostly of grease and tension, the server emerged from the kitchen. The entire table shifted. My family turned their bodies toward me, smartphones raised like weapons, smiles plastered on their faces in anticipation of a moment they had clearly rehearsed. For exactly 3 seconds, I allowed a foolish hope to bloom in my chest. A fleeting thought that perhaps my mother had finally decided to be kind. Then, I saw the inscription. Written in garish, bright pink icing across the center of the cake were the words, "Oops, still a letdown." There was a moment of absolute, suffocating silence, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the booth. Then, the explosion came. The table erupted in raucous laughter. My mother, Beatrice, clapped her hands together with the delight of a child watching a circus act, her eyes crinkling with genuine amusement. My younger brother, Caleb, nearly choked on his soda, his shoulders shaking. Someone, I think it was my Uncle Julian, bellowed, "Oh, lighten up, it's just a joke." I sat frozen, staring at those sugary words that seemed to vibrate under the fluorescent lights. They were not just a joke. They were a confession. They were the unspoken truth of my childhood finally said out loud. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me, like a coat of armor. I pushed my chair back, the metal legs screeching against the linoleum, picked up my purse, and stood up. Beatrice commanded me to sit back down and stop being dramatic. I didn't even acknowledge her. I turned toward the glass doors. Uncle Julian stepped into my path, gripping my arm with a faux avuncular firmness, hissing at me not to make a scene. I leaned in close, as if I were about to offer a tearful apology, and whispered a single, devastating sentence into his ear. 2 days later, my entire family would be spiraling into a panic that had absolutely nothing to do with a birthday cake. If you have an appetite for tangled family secrets and the kind of quiet, strategic revenge that destroys a legacy, stay with me. This is how the House of Cards came down. The diner itself felt like a movie set designed to evoke nostalgia, all red vinyl upholstery, chrome trimmings, and neon lights humming softly above the counter. I had walked in carrying that familiar heavy stone in my gut, the dread that accompanies any event where my family attempts to perform normalcy. Beatrice had commandeered a large corner booth, holding court like a fading queen. She sat with a rigid, practiced posture, her manicured fingers clutching a glass of white wine, her gaze tracking my approach the way a predator tracks a wounded animal. My father, Arthur, sat beside her, his shoulders hunched inward, wearing the defeated expression of a man who had long ago decided that silence was his only survival strategy. Across from them lounged Caleb, phone already in hand, recording snippets of the ambiance, his attention entirely consumed by the digital reflection of reality rather than the people sitting in front of him. Sliding into that booth felt less like joining a celebration and more like stepping back into a cage I had spent years trying to chew my way out of. Beatrice cataloged my appearance immediately. Her eyes swept over my hair, my dress, the way I nervously peeled the wrapper for my straw. Her comments were launched across the table with the casual trajectory of paper airplanes, but each one carried a hidden needle. Arthur remained neutral, a ghost in his own life. Caleb only looked up when the laughter rose, angling his camera to catch my reaction, waiting for the content he knew I would provide. When the food arrived, it was heavy and underwhelming. Burgers that fell apart, fries leaving oily ghosts on the formica, milkshakes melting rapidly under the heat of the lights. The conversation inevitably drifted toward my career, or in their eyes, the lack thereof. Beatrice listed the achievements of her friends' children, reciting their promotions and engagements like a score, then letting the silence hang heavy in the air so I could feel the gap between their lives and mine. No one used the word failure, but it sat at the table with us, an uninvited guest taking up all the space. I caught my reflection in the napkin dispenser, dark circles under my eyes, a polite, brittle smile that didn't reach my gaze. I didn't look like a birthday girl. I looked like a defendant awaiting sentencing.
I felt the exhaustion in my bones, but beneath it, a cold observational detachment began to form. I watched them. I watched the servers moving through the aisles. I watched Beatrice grow more animated as the plates were cleared, her energy spiking as if she were approaching the climax of a play. She glanced toward the service counter repeatedly, a tight excitement in her chest. When the table was finally cleared and the diner's noise level had dipped to a murmur, I saw the server nod at our booth and disappear. Caleb sat up straighter, hitting record. Arthur wiped his palms on his trousers, looking anxious. I sat perfectly still, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure.
The server returned with a sheet cake on a plastic tray, the candles flickering violently as she walked. Heads turned at nearby tables. The cake landed before me, the frosting wobbly at the corners. For that split second, I allowed myself to believe it would be benign. Then I read the pink script. Oops, still a letdown. The reaction was instantaneous. The laughter drowned out the jukebox. Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest, breathless with mirth. Caleb lifted his phone higher to ensure the framing was perfect. Arthur watched me with a terrified curiosity of someone waiting for a bomb to detonate. Sitting there, bathed in the garish glow of neon, with that insult staring back at me from the sugar, I realized I wasn't being overly sensitive. This wasn't a blunder. This was a definition. This was how they saw me, paid for, decorated, and served on a tray. Months before this disaster, I had spent a Saturday at my parents' house performing what they called a quick favor. Arthur's back was spasming, and he needed assistance clearing out the small room he referred to as his study. To him, my free time was a resource he was entitled to. I followed him down the hallway, past the room that used to be mine, into a space that smelled of stale paper and neglect. The office was more of a junk drawer than a workspace. Cardboard boxes formed barricades against the walls, and loose papers cascaded from the filing cabinet. Arthur pointed to a stack of heavy boxes he wanted moved to the garage, then lowered himself into his chair with a groan. I began the mindless work of hauling boxes. Most of the contents were exactly what you would expect: ancient tax returns, expired warranties, bank statements from institutions that no longer existed. It was the archaeological debris of a suburban life. I worked until I reached a particularly heavy box wedged into the back corner. Inside, the hanging folders were pristine, labeled in Arthur's meticulous handwriting. Toward the back, one folder stood out. It was a rich cream color, distinctly different from the standard manila, its corners softened by touch. Across the front, written in blue ink, was my name, Elena. Beneath it, in smaller script, Education Trust. I held the folder for a moment, listening to the rhythm of my own heart accelerate. Curiosity overpowered my respect for privacy. I opened it. The first few pages were official documents from an investment firm. My grandfather, Silas, was listed as the grantor. I saw his shaky, distinctive signature at the bottom, the same one I remembered from childhood birthday cards. The account description was unambiguous. Funds explicitly designated for my university expenses. The early statements showed a pattern of regular deposits, modest at first, then growing substantial as the years progressed. The balance climbed, line by line, a silent testament to a man building a safety net for a granddaughter he wouldn't live to see grow up. For a moment, I hallucinated a different life, one where I walked onto a college campus without the crushing weight of panic about tuition, without the frantic nights working double shifts. Then, halfway through the stack, the pattern shattered. The deposits ceased. Withdrawal slips replaced them. Massive sums were drained from the account in jagged, uneven intervals, sometimes weeks apart. The names authorizing the withdrawals changed too. Beatrice's signature appeared on some, Uncle Julian's on others. Beside the transactions were vague, handwritten annotations: family emergency, temporary loan, household repairs. By the final statement, the balance was essentially zero. The account had been closed just weeks before the summer I sat at our kitchen table, filling out financial aid forms, weeping while my parents told me there was no money, that we were all struggling, that I would have to figure it out on my own. Sitting on the dusty carpet with that folder spread across my lap, I felt the past rewrite itself. There had been money. It had simply been stolen. My hands trembled, but my mind was icy. I pulled out my phone and methodically photographed every single document in the folder. I captured the account numbers, the signatures, the dates, the diminishing balance. I built a digital archive of their betrayal. Then I reassembled the folder, slid it back into its slot, and closed the box.
I carried it to the garage without a word. On the drive home, my bag felt heavier, housing the proof that my family hadn't just mishandled my emotions, they had embezzled my future. Long before the cake spelled it out, they had already spent my potential. The days following the birthday dinner were defined by a deliberate, heavy silence. I turned off my phone when I returned to my apartment and let the world fall away. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, and existed in a vacuum, free from the vibration of their expectations. It felt less like hiding and more like detoxing. In that quiet, the pieces fell into place. I remembered Beatrice dismissing my dreams as expensive fantasies, Arthur staring at the floor when I mentioned tuition costs, Caleb mocking my cheap car. The cake had been the final key, unlocking the reality that their cruelty was not accidental, it was structural. On the second evening, I turned my phone back on. It nearly vibrated off the table. A deluge of missed calls, voicemails, and texts flooded the screen. Beatrice's name dominated the list, followed by Arthur, Uncle Julian, and Caleb. The messages ranged from aggressive to dismissive. Beatrice framed the dinner as a loving gesture I had ruined with my sensitivity. Arthur begged me to talk it out. Julian focused on the rudeness of my departure. Caleb sent memes, trying to turn the abuse into a joke we could share. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I typed a single message into the family group chat.
I stated clearly and without emotion that I was aware of the education trust Grandpa Silas had established for me. I wrote that I had photographic evidence of the account history, the deposits, and the unauthorized withdrawals made by Beatrice and Julian. I added that I would not be discussing this matter over text. There was no drama in the syntax, just the brutal weight of a secret being dragged into the light. When I hit send, the silence that followed was heavier than before, but it felt steady, like the ground finally settling after an earthquake. Shortly after, my phone lit up with a call from Aunt Meredith. She lived 3 states away and had always maintained a polite distance from the family's core dysfunction. Her voice was different, serious, concerned. She had heard the distorted version of the birthday dinner from her daughter, Tessa, who had heard it from the family grapevine. In that version, I was hysterical and delusional. I corrected the record. I told Meredith everything: the folder, the dates, the signatures, the loans I was still paying off. Meredith listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled a long, shaky breath. She admitted that Grandpa Silas had mentioned a fund to her years ago, but when she asked Beatrice, she was told it had been depleted by market crashes. Hearing the truth forced her to confront the lie she had accepted. She asked for the proof. I opened my laptop and emailed her the entire file. Watching the progress bar complete felt like transferring a physical burden from my shoulders to the world. A few hours later, Meredith replied with the contact information for a forensic accountant and an attorney she trusted. She wrote that this was not a family squabble, it was fraud. The attorney, Mr. Vance, operated out of a modest brick building downtown. He was a man of few words and sharp eyes. He reviewed the printed photographs with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. He verified the timeline, the lack of educational payments, and the clear diversion of funds to personal accounts held by my mother and uncle. He explained in plain English that this was actionable. The trust was a legal entity. The money was not theirs to take. He drafted a formal demand letter. It outlined the misuse of funds and demanded a full accounting and repayment, attaching the incriminating documents as exhibits. He copied Aunt Meredith on the correspondence, ensuring there was a witness outside the immediate circle of corruption. When those letters arrived at my parents' house, the tone of the family group chat underwent a radical transformation. The jokes vanished. The gaslighting texts about my attitude were replaced by long, rambling paragraphs about loyalty, family unity, and the cruelty of involving lawyers. Beatrice wrote about how hurt she felt, insisting that every penny taken was used to keep the family afloat, painting herself as a martyr. Arthur sent weak, pleading messages about not tearing the family apart. Caleb went silent, but in the midst of their panic, Tessa, my cousin, began asking questions in the chat. She asked why I hadn't been told about the money. She asked why Beatrice's name was on the withdrawal slips. She didn't have the documents, but her questions proved that the narrative was slipping from my mother's control. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment, feeling a strange sense of detachment. For the first time, I wasn't the crazy one. I was the one with the receipts.
The next phase of the conflict didn't happen on a screen. It happened at my front door. It was late, a rainy Tuesday, when a frantic knocking shattered the quiet of my evening. I knew who it was before I checked the peephole. Beatrice stood in the hallway, her hair frizzy from the humidity, her coat misbuttoned. She looked frantic, stripped of her usual composed veneer. I opened the door but blocked the entrance. She pushed past me, entering my apartment with the entitlement of an owner. Her eyes darted around my modest living space, the secondhand furniture, the stack of bills, the lack of luxury, and I could see her judging it, cataloging my failure to bolster her own confidence. She launched into a monologue she had clearly rehearsed. She spoke in her reasonable voice, the one she used to manipulate teachers and neighbors. She claimed she was worried about my mental state. She said the birthday dinner was just a misunderstanding, a joke that landed wrong. She tried to erase the cake, the laughter, the years of belittlement. Then she pivoted to the money. She framed the theft as a tragedy of circumstance. She spoke of hard times and difficult choices, painting herself and Uncle Julian as heroes who had raided the fund only to save the family from ruin. She tried to make me feel guilty for the loans I had taken, implying that my struggle was noble while their theft was necessary. She wanted me to see their greed as sacrifice. But as I stood there, listening to her rewrite history, I felt two realities colliding. One was the truth, printed in black and white on the bank statements Mr. Vance held. The other was her delusion. There was no apology in her words, only fear. Fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear of losing the house of cards she had built. She wanted me to drop the lawsuit. She wanted me to return to the dark so she could shine. When I told her, calmly and firmly, that I would not be withdrawing the legal action, the air in the room froze. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply refused to be her victim anymore. She looked at me with a mixture of shock and hatred, realizing that her old keys no longer unlocked me.
She left the apartment stiffly, slamming the door on her way out. The court hearing was scheduled for a gray, overcast morning. The courthouse felt imposing, a monolith of stone and judgment. I stood on the steps, feeling the tremor in my hands, reminding myself that I wasn't a child asking for permission. I was an adult seeking restitution. Inside, the courtroom was stark and functional. My parents and Uncle Julian sat on the opposing side, flanked by a lawyer who looked tired. Arthur sat at the end of the bench, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the wood. Aunt Meredith sat behind me, a silent anchor. The judge was a no-nonsense woman who seemed uninterested in the emotional theatrics my mother's lawyer tried to present. They attempted to argue that the funds were used for general family welfare, which indirectly benefited me. They spoke of love and obligation. The judge cut through it. She looked at the trust documents. She looked at the withdrawal dates. She looked at the lack of educational payments. It was simple math. Money designated for A was moved to B without consent. The ruling was clinical and devastating. The judge ordered Beatrice and Julian to repay the principal amount of the trust, plus the calculated interest it would have accrued over the years. If they failed to pay, liens would be placed on their properties. It wasn't a lottery win. It was a correction. It was the restoration of a stolen opportunity. As the gavel came down, I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt a heavy, profound relief. The court didn't fix the years of struggle, the debt I had already accrued, or the emotional scars of being the family scapegoat. But it did one thing. It established the truth. It was a legal acknowledgement that I had been wronged. In the aftermath, the family structure collapsed. Beatrice's house, always her pride and joy, had to be refinanced to meet the repayment schedule. Uncle Julian faced his own financial ruin, his credit destroyed. The extended family, once happy to laugh at my expense, pulled away from them uncomfortable with the proximity to fraud. Beatrice tried to write me one last letter, a sprawling epic of self-pity and justification. I read the first 2 lines, recognized the manipulation, and threw it in the trash. I cut contact completely. No phone calls, no holidays, no updates. It wasn't punishment, it was protection. I started therapy. I began the long, slow work of untangling my self-worth from their approval. Life didn't become perfect overnight. I still had loans to pay, and the money from the judgment would take time to collect. But the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the disappointment. I was the one who had escaped. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about the legal system or financial trusts.
It was about the realization that you cannot save people who are committed to using you as fuel for their own warmth. Sometimes the joke is actually a weapon, and the only way to win is to walk out of the diner, whisper the truth, and burn the bridge behind you so they can't follow. If you believe that breaking the cycle of toxicity is the ultimate revenge, and if you want to hear more stories about standing your ground when the world tries to bury you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to know that walking away is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. Don't let anyone write your value on a cake. See you in the next one.